presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Please have a seat. What a fantastic opportunity we have today. When we started putting this panel together and we started talking about what we wanted to do, the idea of having companies like IBM, Accenture, ConsenSys, and Soramitsu representing Hyperledger and the work that our Hyperledger community does is just fantastic. It's often that you hear panels and you see presentations of people talking about how they use Hyperledger technologies, but really to have 4 companies that are key to what the Hyperledger community is building is amazing. My name is Daniela Barbosa. I'm the Vice President of Worldwide Alliances at Hyperledger. What that means is that I have the privilege and pleasure of working with our members worldwide to make sure that we are able to tell their story of why they're using Hyperledger, why they're using open source, and helping them build communities around these projects, these use cases. The way that the Hyperledger organization works is we have projects, and in front of you, everybody should have a little greenhouse, we call it. We'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. That highlights the projects. But we also have things like special interest groups and working groups. And because we're an open source organization, anyone in this room, you don't have to be a member, can participate, which is fantastic. So just as a high-level introduction to the Linux Foundation, the Linux Foundation has, for the last 20 years, been a place where technologies and companies come to open source their software and build communities, and more importantly, build commercial ecosystems around those technologies. So obviously, most of you should know Linux, the Linux kernel, the original Linux Foundation project. Linux today runs all of the fastest computers in the world. But it also, how many people here have Android phones? All right, so those Android phones are actually derivatives of Linux. And there's about 50 top-line projects within the Linux Foundation that you might be aware of, and some that you might not, that are really changing the way that technology is deployed and used globally and worldwide. So things like automotive-grade Linux. Anybody have a Toyota or a Mazda or is planning on buying a Subaru in 2020? That is running on automotive-grade Linux software stack, their computer systems. If you are in cloud computing, you're using cloud, Kubernetes, which falls under the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, another very large project within the Linux Foundation. And things like Let's Encrypt, the biggest certificate authority project issuing certificates on the internet, is a Linux Foundation project. So I highly recommend that if you don't know the Linux Foundation, you'll be pleasantly surprised across all industries. From a global perspective, we have technologies. And more importantly, we are leveraging the 20 years of experience and resources that the Linux Foundation has put together to help support these projects. Today, I'm hoping to have a conversation, because as I said, it's very rare that we actually get folks to sit and talk about why they work with Hyperledger and why they brought their technology into the Hyperledger Greenhouse. Today, Hyperledger itself has 250 member companies. But keep in mind, anyone can use the technology, anyone can participate in the open source communities. You don't have to be a member, but we do have 250 large, small, medium organizations, government agencies from the Bank of England to the largest universities that are contributing and participating as members in our community. And it's great to see them support open source and obviously these blockchain services. As I mentioned, we want to spend some time understanding the companies and the products and services that you have. I think all of these names are familiar from a brand perspective. So I'm going to let you, and we'll start with Joe, introduce yourself, your company, and maybe talk a little bit about how your company and your groups work within Hyperledger.
How many minutes do I have? Hi, my name is Joseph Lubin. I started my blockchain life in 2011. Before that, I was a mix of technologist and a little bit on the financial side. And Was lucky enough in 2014 to meet Vitalik Buterin about a month after he wrote the white paper describing the Ethereum platform, and I and a few people organized that project around him. A year later, as we were getting close to releasing the platform, version 1, I started a company called ConsenSys to build lots of applications, and it turns out we build lots of the infrastructure for the Ethereum ecosystem. We build with maybe 60% of our attention for public mainnet Ethereum, but it turns out that all of that tooling is applicable for enterprise. And so we've been working with companies, banks, central banks, governments for 4+ years now, and building 4 companies, 4 consortia. We little over 2 years ago, started building the 3rd of our Ethereum clients. We chose to build in Java to be enterprise friendly. We chose to have a very permissive license, Apache 2. One of the issues that some enterprises had with Ethereum clients, and there are quite a few of them, was that they were licensed in a way that made it difficult for their lawyers to accept them. And so we essentially built a highly modular, best in class, in my opinion, enterprise Ethereum client, and we implemented the specification of the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, and in order to complete the picture, it was important to us to become part of the Hyperledger Foundation and to contribute that code to the Hyperledger Foundation. The reason is because that's where a lot of the action is. That's where the highest quality professionals are in the industry. One of them's over there, one of them's sitting to my right. And it's about commitment to open source, and it's commitment to excellence in open governance.
Hi everyone, Kristina Leong, I'm from Accenture. I run Accenture's decentralized identity and biometrics capability globally. Some of you heard me earlier on today. And my focus area is really on sort of indie and the usage of identity and where the use cases, how do we put it into clients, what do they do with it? And as part of my role, I'm the advisor to the World Economic Forum on everything related to digital identity. So why we are excited and have been working from the start with Hyperledger is because also we understand that we're not a product company. We are purely services. So many of your products we use, and we need to put it into our client's environment. We know that we can't do this alone. And many people in blockchain say this, but at the same time, in order for blockchain, for the use cases to work, such as identity, some of it is a public good, in which case identity is truly a public good in order for it to be truly valuable. And that's why sort of working with Hyperledger, contributing back to the code for the code base, working with the developers, we contributed back to interoperability framework, our automation framework, because we know DevOps is really hard. So we built some of the production system. We know this is hard. It's useful for everybody. It's the right thing to do. The other aspect is we need to ensure that our team, our developers, our consultants on the ground are actually inspired, want to work together. And that's also part of being a good citizen back in the network. And that's really part of our sort of people development to enable them to be committed to the open source platforms.
Great, thanks. My name's Jason Kelley, and I work for a company that's about a 108-year-old startup. You may have heard of it, IBM. We tend to look at what we do in blockchain as a startup and have done that from the very beginning. Is that me or is it feedback? Oh, coffee, thanks. That was me, okay. So when we think of blockchain as a capability, and we often just call it the B word, we ran after it in a different way in our company. We have many parts of the company. And just as Kristina said, you know, some people look at it, there's a product, there's consulting, there's cloud, there's research, there's hardware, all of these piece parts. And how many people have ever worked with IBM? It was painful, wasn't it? I'm joking, I'm joking. my CEO is going to say, "What, Jason? What the hell are you saying on stage?" No, many times it has been painful. It's because we are nearly a 400,000 person organization. 250,000 of those are in our services group. We started blockchain across all of that. So when I pulled together my global team, I lead it globally. All of those components are in my blockchain group. Cloud, consulting, our product sets, our solutions, our design team, all of those, we are a subset, a Trojan horse, if you will, to change how industry does business. Because it takes all of that. We were talking outside in the hallway how this thing that we're calling blockchain is different. And so you have to approach it differently. And something we made a bet on early on is something that was different for IBM is that we said, look, let's pick something that's open. Let's pick something that's ready to scale quickly. Let's pick something that has a community that's very innovative and is ready to really move quickly. And that's why we have run with Hyperledger from the very beginning. And we've continued to then branch out, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But it requires us to double down. If you have to move fast, for all of those who have done a startup, I've done them inside and outside of IBM, you have to make a bet and be able to move quickly for entrance and then scale quickly. And that's what we've been able to see with this community, as well as a community that is touching each parts of the ecosystem, from the small to the enterprise, to the private, to the public entities. That's what is unique about this wonderful new capability. We don't call it technology, but a capability that's going to change the way we as consumers can benefit from what has become a very, very complex value chain. So that's why we're making a big bet here. That's why we're here. I'm very happy to be on the stage with such lofty brains here.
So I'm Makoto Takemiya, the CEO and co-founder of a company called Soramitsu. And I look like a typical Japanese guy, I know. I'm actually from California, and I moved to Japan 12 years ago. And I got into blockchain about 2013. And at that time, what really got me into it was this idea of turning money or value into digital data. This is such a valuable concept that you can instantly send value just like sending an email, right? And so through this journey, I created this company, Soramitsu, in 2016. And at the beginning, we were trying to figure out how do we make a blockchain that, taking the lessons learned from previous projects we've worked on and different projects that other people have done, and make something kind of as simple as possible. And so through that exploration, we created a platform called Iroha, and then we eventually became a Hyperledger member, and we were able to contribute that. I think I'll maybe talk about some of that later. But as a small startup with just very limited resources and limited capability, especially at the time we were only in Japan, so we didn't have access to the whole global market. And so through the Hyperledger project, we were able to actually suddenly tap into this huge global dialogue about blockchain and distributed ledger and different use cases. And that, I think, has been so valuable to us as a startup. And it's really, to work alongside, Accenture, IBM, and even like legends like ConsenSys in this field has been really quite an honor. And I think we've been able to improve our technology and use cases for this. So we mainly focus on financial use cases, so things like digital currencies for central banks and digital identity. But through working with the different working groups and the TSC and the different open source community, we've really, I think, come a long way. And I know my team's really grown a lot through their interaction with the Hyperledger project.
So many of you might have heard the Hyperledger Greenhouse, and if you look at the image on the sheets in front of you, it looks like a greenhouse. And the reason is because we are able to have a home basically for companies like Soramitsu and also IBM to be able to participate and have access to the same community, the same governance models. The TSC, the Makoto mentioned, which is the Technical Steering Committee, is made up of community members, people who have contributed and are voted into the Technical Steering Committee as basically stewards of the Technical Steering Committee, made up of multiple companies and individuals as well. And they serve on the TSC, on the Technical Steering Committee, as individuals, but many of them do work for the companies that are members within Hyperledger. Today, we have 15 different projects, plus we also have a Hyperledger Labs, and Christine mentioned Accenture recently submitted a lab, and we can talk about that in a bit, as to why the labs and that process is important. But Makoto, maybe you can tell us a little bit more, as a small company, right, and you have a very global workforce as well, your developers are all over the world. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of community interactions that you see with the companies in our community?
Yeah, so one is definitely coming to things like the maintainer meetings and the members summit. These have been really valuable events for my team, and even being a small startup, we've really tried to convince our team members to go and travel even across the world to go to the maintainers summit and things like that. And through this interaction, we've actually gotten really good feedback on our platform. I do wish that there were more opportunities like that, but it's been nice to actually send people, I think, to 3 continents now, or 4 continents even, to different events, and it's been a really good interaction. So Hyperledger Iroha is, I think, we're a boutique fintech company is the way I like to put it. So it's still a fairly small platform, but I think our philosophy is qualitatively different from a lot of the other ones, and so we're trying to find our niche in the community and also to have this dialogue about, how do we interoperate. So things like interoperating with things like Fabric, for instance, and we built a bridge to Ethereum using a two-way peg. So these are ways to move assets between the platforms, and I think continuing to build these links is a great way to kind of build the greenhouse and help the things to work. One other last example is we recently implemented cryptography using another project, Hyperledger Ursa, which is a great example of a shared resource that the community makes and maintains.
And that's a great point, Ursa, and the tools and libraries that we have, some do come organically. They're created by the community as they decide. Ursa is a cryptographic library. They decided to do that work independent of a specific project. It was a lab, and then it turned into a project. So there's a lot of use cases for that. Jason, IBM is a huge supporter and proponent of open source. Can you give the audience maybe a little overview of why that is, why a company like IBM believes open source is the way?
Well, I almost start with it. It should be almost painfully obvious when we think about anything that grows organically, anything that brings value has to have a sense of being open. It has to have a community. I think it's a perfect fit in our world of blockchain because that's what it drives. We are committed to open. We were part of the original players in the Linux Foundation. We just made a purchase that now gave us about 34 billion reasons to be behind open technology. And specifically in the space that we are here, I think it's very basic, very basic. When you think about something that requires a community and a network to be successful, how can it not be open? And I love the comment about interoperability. Often we start with interconnectivity. And we often hear the platform wars and the technology wars, and we say, look, set all of that aside, because the technology is there. There's no question. I mean, none of us would be sitting in the room if this was some shaky, questionable technology. We have 1,000 plus production-ready clients that are not doubting the technology. The challenge is in the governance, in the structure, and the connectivity across what's being put together. And that's why I will come back to the question, which is open. It's only in an open environment, and not just open technology, but also open design and open communication, and that's cross-industry. Case in point, people say, oh, well, tell us what you're doing in consumer industry. How's that work? And we say, wait a second, back up. Consumer industry, what is that? Having just come from the Consumer Electronics Show and then NRF, National Retail Federation, aren't all of our value chains driven by a consumer in the end? Ultimately, it gets to that consumer, And in order for all of those value chains to work together, we should be working in an open environment. And that begins with some of our largest networks, and I'll end on this example, is that as you think about where we made our safest bet, first was with what we're doing in Hyperledger because of what I said. It's ready to take to the enterprise. However, then we made another bet, and we said, what are we going to do first? And we have what we call the food trust network. And how many people eat food? Raise your hand. You get my point. So it was very easy to say, well, if you trust your food and you want it, so why don't we do it? So that was the first thing. And we said, well, wait, that food has to be shipped. And then we said, well, how can we do it now? We have a consortium that covers 60% of the trading lanes around the world. And we said, wait a second, that has to be financed. Someone has to pay for that, finance that chip. So we then have a consortium which is the largest production transacting consortium in trade finance that exists at present with WeTrade. What did I just say? I said three things. I said consumer trade, I said actual shipping and trade, and I said trade finance. 3 networks. Do you think those 3 networks have different ecosystems? No. So shouldn't they be working together? Yes. And how can they do that quickly? On an open platform. So that's not just some PowerPoint slide or some gee whiz stuff we're doing on a whiteboard. That's real stuff. Those are real clients. Those are real examples. Those are real transactions. And that's a real open platform driven by what we're doing here with Hyperledger.
Christine, do you want to share some of your production use cases and some of the work that Accenture is doing?
Sure. Several. One of, I think, the most interesting, I talked about this a little bit earlier, is the Known Traveler Digital Identity Program, which is the world's first blockchain-based biometric cross-border, a bit of a mouthful, digital identity that's basically between the 2 governments of Netherlands and Canada, KLM Air Canada, the 3 airports, Schiphol, Montreal, and Toronto. We're providing the technology to enable passport-free travel. Paperless, you can go share your trusted, verifiable identity using Indy, and it's production grade. Live passengers will be going through it in a few months, and it will be, you can share your trusted data that you can get from either your Dutch citizen or Canadian citizen. You get it in your wallet, your identity wallet on your phone. You share that up before you even get to the airport, sitting on your couch at home. And your destination airport, the airplane, the airline, the airport will know that you're coming. And you don't have to queue. You can walk through. You don't have to fidget and get paper boarding passes out and all of that kind of thing, and be able to share that and be trusted. Organizations can know that to spend the right money, resources on actual securing the dodgy people and getting away from those people from our borders and enabling passengers to have a much more seamless, personalized experience, extending that to hotels, car rental, and that's actually no different than the banks, and extend that to our travel insurance and healthcare and so on. So that's one of our production grade system that's coming. We have another production one where it's also identity, where identity of companies, 3,000 companies right now with a government and a state-owned bank that have identity of companies to enable trade, to enable them to do business, getting registered quickly for a company in the UK. To get a bank account from opening your company to getting a bank account takes 64 days in the UK. I don't know whether Brexit is going to make that faster or slower. But either way, that's far, far, far too slow in an economy like today. So how can we make that more trusted, quicker? You don't have to have stacks of paper. You see what I see, I can trust it. I can check the identity of the company. When they change directors, they can share that data in a secure manner. And those are some of the projects that we have. Amongst others, there are healthcare, there are banking ones. We even have ones that are on checking, and one of actually 2 of my favorite ones is on identity of livestock. So did they cross border? Did these cows, and I'm really serious here, these cows cross border? Actually, in developing countries, it's really, really critically important because my 100 cows that belongs to me might have cross borders. They might not be able to enter back again because there might be African swine flu. And if I lose that, that's my entire livelihood, my family's livelihood. So ability to be able to track those and say they're vaccinated, they are come from a, a disease-free zone, they are well kept, that enables my livelihood to be a lot better. I can sell them for organic, so on and so forth. So all of that ability to track even things like, cows or carbon or so on and so forth, identity of those things also critical, are something that we're doing today.
Joe, maybe you can share with us some use cases that you're seeing in the marketplace as well.
Happy to, thank you. So our most publicly visible project is a project called Comgo. It's a commodities trade finance platform. Comgo's brought together major banks and major energy companies. It implements a handful of use cases. We built phase one, building phase two of it. Phase one has things like letters of credit, backup letters of credit, and invoice, receipt discounting, and a whole bunch more use cases. It's seen over $1 billion of transactions. We went live with it last December, 13 months ago, and one remarkable thing about the platform is how quickly it took us to build, or we were able to build it from start to finish to actual public launch of phase one. It took about 6 months, and that includes integration with all of these institutions. The technology is Hyperledger Besu, and it has a privacy and confidentiality overlay so that all of the transactions on the network are obfuscated. You don't see the source or destination or the details of what happened. And this sort of complexity in previous technologies would probably take 2 or 3 years to implement. But because of the Ethereum blockchain technology, you get so much secure transactional infrastructure for free. You get backup systems for free. You essentially set up a bunch of nodes at the different institutions. You point them at each other. They connect and they stay connected. And so that project it represents a breakthrough in how complex projects can be delivered.
And Makoto, I know you have some live networks in production as well. Can you talk a little bit about those?
Yes, we do a few different things. Systems that are running now, we just launched the digital currency project for the Kingdom of Cambodia, working with the central bank there. So that went live in July and has a few thousand users now and a few $1 million kind of running around the system, which is really kind of a fun project. It's a good way to bring financial inclusion, and I know some of the other speakers at some of the panels here at the GBBC have talked a little bit about that as well. But yeah, financial inclusion is really important in countries where you don't have proper financial markets infrastructure. And so using blockchain technology, you can easily and fairly trust minimized, you can bring these systems to masses of people. We're also doing some stuff with kind of public cryptocurrencies, which is interesting as well because blockchain can do, well, in my opinion, the main use case is digital scarcity. So payments and things like identity are the most interesting things to me personally. And building systems where you have, anyone can join your network and validate transactions and create assets, that's a really cool use case. So we're trying to actually go beyond this and create a collaborative way to manage a decentralized economic system, which is, it's a fun project. A lot of it's very research oriented, but working with the central bank and then also working with our own pet project as well is kind of a fun thing. So both of those went live last year after a couple years of development. So it's a lot more fun when you have real users in your system, and it also shows the power of the technology, and it's driven a lot of use case requirements for future versions, I think.
Joe, speaking of public and private, specifically in the enterprise use cases, right? As we mature, Hyperledger has been around for 4 years. ConsenSys, the first year that Hyperledger was formed, you participated in as well. tell us, or go back 4 years and fast forward, 4 years. Where are we now? Like, what should the audience be looking at in regards to, the public versus the permissioned network?
Yeah, 4 years ago, we attempted to contribute an Ethereum code base to the Hyperledger Foundation, and politically it ended up being a little complicated. So ConsenSys was trying to facilitate that, and eventually, a few years later, we got our new code base done with all the appropriate licensing. Early on, it was all about public mainnet blockchain, and 5 years ago, when we got started, institutions, mostly financial institutions, but others, were very curious about the technology. Some were curious because they were concerned about the technology, and some were curious just because they saw that there could be tremendous efficiencies and new business models in this new collaborative trust infrastructure that public blockchain, massively decentralized blockchain represented. We built a professional services practice, and we built for lots of different kinds of institutions over the years. And that pretty much always had to be on private permissioned implementations of the technology. It wasn't really for scalability reasons, because in a private context, we were able to run Ethereum nodes at many hundreds of transactions per second, and now we can, with new technology, we can do way, way better than that. The issue really was political and with respect to privacy and confidentiality. And so essentially all of those issues have been solved on public mainnet at this point. We have technology now that sits at layer 2 above public Ethereum that can do 18,000 transactions per second. We're going to multiply that by about 500 times very soon. And we have, through zero knowledge technology or other systems, we have the ability to have private data and confidential transactions on public mainnet. But through the years, we've had to build out use cases in contexts where organizations were more comfortable. And so it was, in some cases, intended that those use cases, those production systems would stay private. Some would be semi-public or semi-open, and some were intended to be built on a private context, but then migrate when appropriate to public Ethereum. We've built some things over the years. For instance, we built an equities exchange on public mainnet. It went live a few months ago, that is regulated by the Monetary Authority of Singapore. So we're seeing real comfort in organizations to put some use cases as appropriate on public mainnet. We are working on a project with a couple of major institutions. It's a little bit sensitive. There will be an announcement in probably 2 or 3 weeks. And this is it makes use of zero knowledge technology to take agreements, private information from different counterparties to a transaction and entangle that data in such a way as it's non-repudiable and essentially impossible to understand what's going on unless you know exactly what the transactions are. It's a tokenized system, and the organizations that are involved in a transaction can use public mainnet to memorialize what's going on and to track and modulate what's going on over time. So we're very excited for an announcement. There will be a bunch of major names on that announcement, and it represents, I think, a watershed moment in how enterprise will find more and more ways to use public blockchains.
And Jason and Christine, both of you work with customers that are looking at multiple platforms that might be thinking of participating in multiple networks as well. Can you talk a little bit about what you see with your customers and markets in regards to the selections or the choice or the processes in making a decision as to what DLT you might move forward with?
One of the things that recently, over the, I think, last, I would say 6 to 9 months, some of the most interesting aspects of what we see in the customer is that they use what they know. They Google, oh, Fabric. Okay, we're going to put everything on Fabric. Oh, we're going to put everything on Ethereum. Actually, there are so many different platforms, so many different capabilities. And very often, what they already read on Google is already old. Because the key brains, many are in this room, there are lots of things out there that are not easy to understand. So one of the things that we see very often at clients is that, hold on, let us help you, the real people who know how this should work. What are the right platforms for your use case? What are the right technology stack for your use case? How can you make that interoperable? How can we use different bits of capabilities to make it work? I think that is something that organizations, as they embark on their journey on blockchain, need to think about. Don't use what you just know and what everybody else is using. Just because everybody else is using it, it might not be right for you and your use case. I think that's critical. And otherwise it's back to the whole, oh, blockchain isn't worth it because I got to spend millions re-platforming the last 2 years of what I just built, and it actually doesn't work because the next bit of what we're releasing in Aries, in Ursa, actually will solve half of those problems. So get with the community, understand how it works, be part of the community to know that this is coming, use what's coming, and don't build all of your logic just because you happen to know that name.
We're seeing a lot of the questions of which technology or with which platform, even which provider. I think a lot of that our clients are telling us and showing us that was a big deal. People like conflict. They want, oh, you got it's this or that, and it also makes good stories for us to all read in the fodder that's out there, right? That was, for us, that was an issue during the blockchain tourism phase, when everyone was just going through trying to figure it out. And we even now move away from the term use case, because a use case often is very defined for one part of a company. What we're now driving toward, our clients are asking us, what's the outcome that we're going to get? And that outcome could be then a mix of many use cases, because it's going to have a provenance piece, it's going to have an ID piece, there's going to be a zero proof case, there's going to, all these things come together. And our clients are saying, now that's something that has value, and here's the ultimate outcome that my end user, my consumer, now is ready to pay more, or is excited that they're paying less, or that they're assured that what they just consumed should cost more and it's sustainable. So these are the outcomes that are now part of the conversation at the offset. So that means once they get to that and you tell them they can have that, they're wowed to how. So we talk about this, wow our clients to how. They go, wow, we can do all that? Now tell us how. And then that will vary because of that outcome. That outcome will give them fewer choices in most cases of where they should start. They will say, well, I want to start with what's proven and is already scaled. Can I join an existing network? Or even better, do I even need blockchain? Right? So this is the way that we're now approaching, I think, a more mature market, because those that decided they were going to do the POC, the proof of concept, or the POV, as one CIO told me, she said, and then we ended up with a POI. Anybody know what that is? It's a proof of incompetence. And they said, we wasted all that time when we knew the technology worked. We knew that we were going to get business value. Why did we do all those things? Instead of saying, what's the right outcome? Because many of them proved it, all those things, and then they hit the stall button. And that stall button is because there's no true outcome or business value that they're getting out of playing around with this technology. So that's what we've seen, is that those conversations have become fewer. And now it's even better because they're not pitting one off the other. They're actually saying, wait a minute, we have to do more than one. And that goes back to the original thought is why should it be open and what should we be doing is we should be working towards interconnectivity and where we see a path to interoperability.
Excellent. I think we have about 10 minutes. Where's my time person? About 10 minutes. Would love to open it up to questions from the audience, if there's any questions. Can you here, I'll play mic.
Hello. What do you think of the stance of central banks on blockchains? Will it be open? Will it be permissioned? What do you think? The future, 5 years to come.
I think they'll do whatever they want to do.
Of course.
I think it's a very powerful technology. Blockchain is a very powerful technology, and there's a spectrum between total control and the ability to introspect into transactions and token-based money where you can't really trace anything, source, destination, amount. Different nations will, according to their different political philosophies, will build what they want to build, and brings up a bigger issue. So central banks they don't need blockchain to implement digital currencies. They do need some of the cryptographic elements. Some will probably end up on the side of greater privacy for certain transactions, and maybe it's only transactions below a certain limit. But the interesting thing here is that it represents, so this is a moment where we are transforming from an analog global culture to a digitized global culture. And we need to make decisions about what the organizing principle is going to be for our systems, for our economic, social, political, financial systems. Some nations will choose top-down command and control, and they're going to be enormously powerful at the top of those pyramids. We're going to be squeezing out the frictions and the delays in our systems, and that's great all around. But if we don't use this new, potentially massively decentralized trust foundation to diffuse power and to diffuse sovereignty and governance, then we're going to have systems that are very top-heavy in terms of power. And so our company, our ecosystem, the Hyperledger Foundation, the drive towards interoperability, and the focus on designing a sort of interoperable ecosystem of different elements is incredibly important. These are open elements, these are modular, these are APIs. You can switch in and out different pieces, and that's going to enable us to potentially build an architecture for certain societies on this planet that is just much more inclusive, so that people will be able to have greater economic and political agency on collaboration networks.
Thank you. So just to put in a couple points, as far as the whole public versus private, if everyone used public infrastructure, of course that would be, from a technologist standpoint, the ideal. Unfortunately, a lot of central banks are a fairly conservative lot, so they want to just kind of start with doing the same thing they're doing now, and just create really a protocol for digital money. And this has some potential to help, increase the efficiency of society. So what we did in Cambodia is we kind of put even retail customers on the same platform as the banks and the central bank. And so people can just transact in a kind of a peer-to-peer way. Everyone's kind of level on the same platform instead of having all these different silos at each bank like you have in most countries today. And so things like this are a step in the right direction. I think eventually you'll be able to have systems that are that can preserve privacy while not being controlled by any single person. And I think if you look out into the future, without, let's say 100 years from now, a lot of the monetary infrastructure, I think, is going to be shared or clustered in a few different places, rather than just having each country having their own currencies in their own ways. So, of course, Keynes talked about this with the Bancor model, which was really a brilliant idea. It's too bad that it wasn't taken more seriously. But I think the whole world is going to see a more unified financial markets infrastructure and central bank digital currencies, especially as we go towards 2030. So it's not like something that's decades away. It's really kind of going to happen in the next few years, and we're going to see a lot more of what we've been doing in the last few years, I think.
Can I go? So it's good to see everyone's talking about interoperability, right? But what I don't see too much happening in the market is who is actually working on interoperability. There is a proven technology. Joe, probably you know from ConsenSys, semantic blockchain is a proven technology to interoperate across multiple ledgers. But there is not a single ledger platform that supports semantic data structure. So where do you think the market should go? Is that the right place to put money, or what's the next big thing in the ecosystem?
I'll take a quick stab at that. So it's very early in terms of interoperability. Hyperledger has an interoperability project. Hasera, a big contributor and leader of Hyperledger, has built interoperability between Ethereum and Fabric. So there are early attempts at this. There are just starting to be commercial demands for different ledgers to speak to one another, essentially because different projects have chosen different technologies, and now they find they have to speak to one another. On the identity side, it's obviously it's been called a public good, the infrastructure for identity, and there will be people who build tools who make money on those tools, but it is fundamentally important that almost all of that identity and reputation infrastructure, verifiable credentials or verifiable claims, enabling one identity to lodge some attestations against the characteristics or behavior of another identity, or say something about content, which also needs identity. All of that is partially being tracked in the Hyperledger Foundation. It's also being driven by the Decentralized Identity Foundation. It's feeling to me like a bunch of different organizations iterated on the subtleties and the depth, the different aspects of identity and reputation for the last few years, and it's been going on way before blockchain started. And we have what I believe is the component foundations of the decentralized identity infrastructure. And it's protocol independent. It benefits from blockchain, and blockchain benefits from it, but it's not dependent on blockchain. And I'm really excited about how our different implementations are essentially drawing from the same design, and we're still going to have to figure out how all of the different implementations talk to one another. But there's pretty good commitment in the ecosystem to pursue, mature our different approaches while still talking to each other and figuring out how to work together technically.
And one of Accenture's one of the lab project was the interoperability framework that was a bit of code that we donated back to the Hyperledger because interoperability, as we all know, and for many years, is a big problem. And as Joe says, the bit around identity, there are standards around the interoperability. The W3C is another one. Lots. But actually, part of the interoperability issue is not just on a technical level. It's on the governance and organization and sector level. If we're going to set up some blockchain network for identity that is between two governments, when 3 other governments, 5 other airlines, 6 other hotel groups join, if they all do different ones, and even though there may be a standard for verifiable claims that are emerging, how are they all going to read if they have different political and different organizational governance around that? That's not interoperability. Technically, you can all interoperate, but without the legal, without the rails, the organization leaders at the top say, yes, we will interoperate. And yes, we are going to read your data and trust your data and trust your proofs. That's true interoperability. And when we're doing that with the government of Canada and Netherlands, the hardest part wasn't the technology. We can all do that. The hardest part was for the two governments to sign and agree, all of the organizations to agree that, yes, we're going to do this together. That bit is much harder work.
That's almost a chicken and egg story.
Well, I really do believe it's back to we have no clients running away from us saying we're going to wait until it's interoperable. They're not doing that. What we have, and Kristina's a perfect example. So one of our teams is launching a short documentary film at Sundance this coming weekend. I have the joy of going from one place where they ski to the next place where they ski, and I don't get to ski. I actually snowboard, but I just get to stare at the slopes. And it's a real case where, as part of a disaster relief after Hurricane Harvey, we couldn't get Hurricane Harvey in the United States, was in the southern part of the United States, in Texas. And there was a challenge getting resources to the people who needed those resources. 2 years later, there are still people waiting for assistance. And we're better than that as humans. As we sit here at WF, we're better than that. We're smarter than that. We can put machines on a planet that's hundreds of millions. We can do that, but we can't get someone disaster relief in 2 years? Come on. And so with that, we said, okay, well, a group of private-public partnership put money together, came up with a platform to make it happen, and said, look, this works, this is real. Guess where the challenge is? Interoperability between the organizations that have to verify and validate the person that needs it from a federal level, a state level, to a city level, to an organization level. That's the challenge. It's not the technology.
Yeah. So I think there could be panel after panel on that issue of governance and certainly interoperability. But I want to thank the panelists for joining us today and sharing a little bit about what you do with Hyperledger and how you participate. I'm sure some of you will stick around for a little bit, maybe if there's any more questions. I also want to thank the GBBC for hosting Hyperledger. Sandra, if she's there, thank you, and the staff, you have all been wonderful. And thank you for coming to this panel, and we really appreciate any questions. Brian Bellendorf is over there. He's our executive director. Please do approach us. We're happy to answer and point you in the right direction. And I think, as Jason said, or somebody, or Christine actually, there's a lot of ways that you can learn about Hyperledger, get your teams, get your engineers, get your business people involved in the project. It will go a long way, whether you're building it yourself or you're working with vendors and partners. So thank you.